Get your first 6 lines for just $39.95.
That's today. Some breaking news to report here from that courtroom in Minneapolis. Again, we get these notes periodically from our producers who were there inside the courtroom. Just a few moments ago, a note came in.
Got the Wolfman.
A deputy there. The deputy says that they have removed the visitor's chair for former officer Derek Chauvin. They removed that chair from the courtroom because, quote, nobody has used it. If somebody comes, they might be putting the chair back in that courtroom. But again, our eyes and ears on the ground in that courtroom are reporting that since this trial has started, the former officer has not had a visitor there in the courtroom, so they've taken that visitor's chair away. Meanwhile, the CDC just updated its guidance on COVID transmission through surfaces. They now say the risk is actually quite low. Moments ago, CDC Director Dr. Rochelle Walensky talked about that at the White House COVID response briefing.
People can be infected with the virus that causes COVID-19 through contact with contaminated surfaces and objects. However, evidence has demonstrated that the risk by this route of infection, of transmission, is actually low.
Here are the latest facts at this hour. This morning, a new milestone. The United States is now administering an average of more than 3 million vaccine doses every day. In fact, on Saturday alone, we administered more than 4 million shots in arms. And right now, vaccine eligibility is expanding in 7 more states to anyone over the age of 16. Those states are Nevada, New Mexico, Iowa, Michigan, Kentucky, Tennessee, and
Where the Wolfman go, bro?
There are now 26 states that are allowing all adults to get a shot. And in the San Francisco Bay Area,
No, you're not young spry no more, dude.
COVID variant that was first identified in India. This new strain of the virus has 2 mutations that may make it more infectious. That's the very latest on the pandemic front.
Where's that
That's
ring?
going to do it for me this hour. Andrew Mitchell will pick up our coverage after a short break.
With Infinity Now, your test drive comes to you. So you can try one car one day.
Mrs. Downs. Let's get this done.
And another the next. Find the kind of luxury that fits you. You'll know. Experience luxury on your terms when you purchase or lease a new Infinity online with Infinity Now. Finance any new 2020 or 2021 Infinity model at 0% APR for 72 months at your local Infinity retailer.
Whoa.
The COVID vaccines are here.
And it's been a little confusing.
So it's more important than ever to make a plan. Visit planyourvaccine.com.
To find out when and where to get your vaccine, so you'll be ready when it's your turn.
So, baby, chill.
It takes baby steps. Let's start by reducing hiring bias, training managers, and guaranteeing an
Snake.
inclusive workforce. Take your first step. Become a Sherman today to get the tools you need.
The last time I had a big break was about
Can we get up there? Oh, good boy.
all that and started my relationship with Chime. Banking with Chime is super easy. It's been such a wonderful experience. I don't even know what it feels like to be screwed by a bank.
Hey, don't hurt the little sapling, bro.
Like, I kind of suppressed those dark days.
Yeesh. Oopsie. Revive. Sorry, buddy.
The walls may be thin, but at least their internet is private.
I'm scared of this Grimshaw.
It sure is, Rita.
X-Side Security keeps all your connected devices protected from network threats. Let's fall or visit a store today.
It'll be okay,
At
miss.
Ibotta, we're working toward a better future. From giving you cash back when things you like every day, to creating a more sustainable world for our loved ones. So this April, Ibotta is partnering with Brand to commit up to $5 million in cash back on your hopes and welcome the trees for the future to help plant up to 1 million trees. Shop your disability office for the cash back now and help us plant trees for the future. Download the free app and browser extension today and get up to $20 in welcome bonuses.
We're done with disposables. Introduce some super latex underwear from NYX. The most absorbent period undies ever. They look and feel and machine wash just like regular underwear. Because we're done with tampons running out, pads getting twisted, and days being ruined. Leave that trash behind and switch to super comfortable, super confident, super legal.
Be nice, Nelly.
Visit NYX.com.
With Visible, you get unlimited data for as little as $25 a month. But when you bring a friend, you get a month for $5. So I'm bringing everyone within 12 degrees of me. Damn. 12 months of $5 wireless. Visible wireless that gets better with friends.
Moment of truth. The dishes are clean, but are they dry? Yeah, they are. Thanks to Cascade Power Dry Rinsing from the #1 most trusted brand. Get your dishes clean, dry.
You okay, Mr. Morgan?
Nope, Morgan dying.
I don't know. These are challenging times for all of us. Yes, very challenging. You don't see yourself somehow. I've always
Carbon dioxide.
I've left the morphine, sir.
Reverend Swanson, would you excuse us a minute?
Do you recall what the blood carbon dioxide
New York?
was?
We are going to go to New York. They have been chasing us south and east and west. We're going to get a boat, we're going to get on a river, and we're going to go north. New York. Then Tahiti, the Fiji Islands, or this place, New Guinea, dancing girls, freedom. But first, we have to make a whole lot of smoke, a whole lot of commotion. And then we decide. We need more commotion. One score and one whole hell of a lot of noise. We ain't so good
And
at
that
doing scores
indicates
anymore, Dutch.
an exceptionally high
Are you
carbon
feeling all
dioxide.
right, Arthur?
Yes.
Sure, fine. We've interrupted.
For a healthy person, and you did a blood gas sample, what would you expect?
Brought a friend, Arthur.
Hello.
Hello. Dutch. This is Eagle Flash. His father is a great chief. Charles and I,
You would expect somewhere between
Intended to
35
be
and
mercenaries.
45.
Did me a great favor.
And so, Mr. Floyd's carbon
Dutch Van Allen.
dioxide level was more than 2
How
times.
do you do?
Not well, sir.
Well, I am sorry to hear that. How's your father?
Now, when you,
Father is
the reason that
confused.
you're doing these blood
Wisdom
gas
with
samples
weakness.
is in part to
His
help
people,
you
my people.
analyze and figure out
We've suffered
courses
too
of
much.
care.
Been lied to too much. Now they're taking our horses.
Who?
The infantry division posted at Fort
And
Wallace.
that,
Why?
Favors is a liar and a murderer. His people won't stop until we're all
is
dead.
essentially
The horses cannot hunt without hunting. We will starve. This is another act of war.
I see that.
Correct.
Men have helped me before. I have money.
They are therefore not
Put your money away,
to ventilation or breathing.
What do you think, Charles?
You know I told your father I will not fight over some horses.
It can, yes.
But I made no such
That
promise.
increase in
Come
the
along.
carbon dioxide from a 35 to 45 to over 100,
must go with them.
that takes some period
Try to
of
stop
time
things from
in
getting
order to climb
out
that.
of hand.
Yes.
Yes, it can happen relatively quickly depending on how severe the ventilation problem is, but
Generally, it could take 30, 40, even an hour to climb that high.
it could take that long. It could take much less time, yes.
The use of fentanyl really rolled out to attribute to high carbon dioxide levels.
This is all that's wrong
It
with this world.
can cause high carbon dioxide levels because it depresses the ventilation or the breathing.
So when someone ingests fentanyl, it can cause them to feel very sleepy because of an increased carbon dioxide.
Anyway, son, tell me about this Colonel
And that's one of the reasons ultimately why fentanyl is so dangerous.
He and his regiment take pleasure in persecuting us. All the young have been taken from our reservation, shipped off to reform schools. Many women, too. The old are weak
Now,
and
you
sick,
testified
but they
that
deliver
when
withhold
paramedics,
medicine and supplies from us.
Gave their
This
report
ends
to you.
today. You have my
They did
word
not
on
give you
that.
any reference as to potential drug use, correct? They did not tell you that they have administered Narcan or naloxone during their care, correct?
Why are you getting involved
During the
in
course
this,
of your
Dutch?
care of
You
Mr.
know me.
Floyd,
We
you
shoot
did not
fellas that need
administer
shooting. We save
Narcan or
fellas that need
naloxone.
saving. Feed them as need feeding.
And when you talk about those drugs that
It's
are
been quite a
immediately able
while
to
since
reverse
we
the
helped
effects,
anyone but
that's what
ourselves,
that
and even
does.
you know that.
Narcan reverses
I
the
told
effects
you,
of
noise. We need noise, Parker. Noise and faith. I still don't know what that means. Stop questioning and think. Just think.
When someone has a high carbon dioxide
Pinkertons
level,
have had time to
that causes
reinforce.
that person to have a
The civilized
sensation of
world
shortness
is
of breath.
closing on us. Who knows what else Molly told them? We need to move towards a conclusion now.
And that can happen to a person in without
Doors.
Some good, honest conflict between the army and the Indians might be just the distraction we need. Kill two birds with one stone.
Yes.
Cornwall was funding the Pinkertons' assault on us. Why do you think I dealt with them? With Cornwall gone, the government is far more likely to divert them to other issues, especially if there's one more scandal. And then we can slip away. Like I said, we just need that noise and one more score. You know, I went back for the chest I had hidden outside Shady Bell, and we're close, Arthur. That dynamite, the railroad contract with the army, it was all in those papers Mike found.
Simply because a person has a history of
You just
chronic
have to
opiate
trust me.
abuse, does that mean that fentanyl can't kill them?
No.
When someone is
There's payday.
hyperventilating,
All right now, girl.
anxious and hyperventilating, they're actually
Men, like I
decreasing
said,
their CO2
they'll help us.
levels.
I got the canoes. The boat is still moored in the channel.
Good. Come on, let's go.
Some of the considerations that you have to take also would be the potential occlusion of a coronary artery, right?
Yes. In cases of cardiac arrest, yes.
And someone who has greater than a
We need to get
75%
that boat
occlusion
ashore.
of the right
I think the
coronary
best plan
artery,
is to paddle
that
up there
poses
silently.
a particular
Or
risk of
then
fatal
when we got control, we'll deal with that anchor and float away. We'll be ashore before anybody even knows what happened.
And good day, I'm Andrea Mitchell in Washington as the prosecution continues to present witnesses in the Derek Chauvin trial. Today's focus so far, the doctor who was on duty when George Floyd was brought to the ER, Dr. Bradford Langenfeld, testifying he tried to resuscitate George Floyd after paramedics administered CPR, that he was in cardiac arrest, meaning his heart had stopped functioning. He also told the jury that he was unable to use electric shock to restart George Floyd's heart. And it did not appear that Mr. Floyd suffered from a heart attack. He's now being cross-examined by the defense attorney, and this is Shaq Brewster in Minneapolis and New York. Professor Melissa Murray joining us, former Deputy Assistant Attorney General Harry Whitman, and Civil Rights Attorney David Henderson. Shaq, first to you, I know this may be a very brief sidebar. Let's get in the importance of Dr. Langenfeld's testimony so far.
We heard right before the morning break, Andrea, the doctor said that he suspected the cause of death after working on George Floyd for nearly 30 minutes. He suspected the cause of death to be oxygen deprivation, essentially asphyxia. That's a term that you don't see in the medical examiner's report, but this is the doctor, the physician who was in the hospital trying to resuscitate George Floyd. So that was a key part, a key piece of testimony that you heard from the doctor. I'll tell you, based on the notes that we're getting from inside the courtroom, those two reporters who are watching this, they say that that was a moment when you saw the jury, almost every member of the jury, start taking notes when the doctor made that assessment and testified to the examination. Eric Nelson started to make one of the points where he said that fentanyl or methamphetamine, because it looks like the court's session's all stopped.
Right, the judge is now looking at the clock and is about to go back to the witness. The witness is Dr. Langenfeld, and the defense attorney crossing is Eric Nelson.
Depends where you're practicing.
In the state of Minnesota?
I'm out.
Yes.
A paramedic can't declare a person dead.
No, not without consultation with the physician.
So just to, based on your treatment, again, of Mr. Floyd, based on these tests that you did, had an elevated CO2 level, correct?
Yes.
And that CO2 level was considered to be exceptionally high, correct?
Correct.
And you did not, in the course of your consideration, provide naloxone or Narcan?
No.
And it would be, is it fair to say that the administration of Narcan, if you do not have opiates in your system, is a safe procedure?
Yes.
And if you do have opiates in your system, the administration of Narcan could be life-changing, life-saving?
Yes. Not in this case.
Prior to the, again, the paramedics, also based on your information, did not administer Narcan.
Correct. Can I make a clarification?
I'm sorry?
Distinguish.
And you would agree that Mr. Floyd arrived at HCMC at approximately 8:53? If we seen evidence previously.
That sounds correct.
I have no further questions.
Which one, though?
So as far as Dr. Langenfeld, there was an answer you wanted to clarify. Please do so.
Only to state that Narcan, administering Narcan to someone who potentially suffered a fentanyl overdose, once that individual is in cardiac arrest, the administration of Narcan would provide no benefit.
And Mr. Floyd was obviously in cardiac arrest.
Correct.
You were asked questions just now about whether fentanyl works by causing someone to feel very sleepy.
What the hell? Take it back, what's all?
Or anything that sounds
The report that I received was that the patient, Mr. Floyd, was unresponsive on their arrival and did not have a pulse. So there was no report that he had been sleepy or difficult to arouse, per se.
You asked quite a bit of questions. First off, if a person is suffering from hypoxia, that is oxygen deficiency, is that an explanation for
It can be in severe cases.
in this case,
We're headed for those rocks! Hold on!
In support of what I was thinking at the time.
What is wrong with
What's difficult in cases of cardiac arrest is when someone has been in cardiac arrest for an extended period of time.
Yeah, I think so. But there's a huge hole in the boat. Horses are spooked. We're taking on water. Boss, get him out of here!
Consistent with cardiac arrest from a number of causes. You expect the pH to be
Well,
low.
whatever else is wrong with you, quite the best pilot I've ever come across.
During cardiac arrest, there's no blood flow to the tissues, therefore there's no oxygen getting to the tissues. Therefore, the cells will die. Will release hydrogen ions, which lower the pH, creating an acidic environment. Will release lactate, which complicates that further. Because the person's heart has stopped from whatever cause, they'll no longer be breathing either. And so we would expect that their CO2 to be, again, it can vary a little bit depending on the cause, but in my estimation, the blood gas in this
Come on, you. Wrong way.
wasn't very strong evidence for one cause over another as far as the etiology there is.
And it was simply consistent with the fact of cardiac arrest. Correct. The fact that the heart had stopped. Correct.
And both of the ICU may have suggested a respiratory cause.
We were asked questions about somebody administering narcotics interrectally. Remember that those questions?
Yeah.
Did you get any indication that Mr. Floyd had administered narcotics interrectally?
I had no information to suggest that.
Dr. Wonderful, thank you.
Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you, Your Honor. Your Honor, the state calls Chief Madeira Arredondo.
And this, of course, is the police chief. Police Chief Arredondo. This is very unusual to be a prosecution witness. He has been outspoken in interviews with us before. He did not even want to be in a room with Derek Chauvin. Let's listen to Phoenix Gordon.
And before you begin, if you give us your full name, spelling each of your names.
Yes, Your Honor. Madeira Arredondo. First name is spelled M-E-D-A-R-I-A. Last name is A-R-R-A-D-O-N-D-O. Mr. Sisher.
Thank you, Your Honor. Sir, what is your current role?
My current role is Chief of the Minneapolis Police Department.
How long have you held that position?
For approximately 3 years.
And as Chief of the Minneapolis Police Department, are you responsible for overseeing the operations of the entire Minneapolis Police Department?
Yes, I am.
And that's the highest ranking role at the Minneapolis Police Department, is that correct?
All you guys?
Now, sir, I'd like you to first share a little bit about yourself with us. How old are you?
54.
Man, don't tell me we glitch, bro.
Twin Cities.
Where are you from originally?
Minneapolis.
Where did you go to high school?
The Minneapolis Roosevelt High School.
Right. And have you ever lived outside of the Twin Cities, Minneapolis area?
I went away for college for a couple of years in Michigan.
Where in Michigan did you go?
It was Hancock, Michigan.
Which school?
Which is now called Finlandia University. I'm sorry, Your Honor. Finlandia University.
And what is the highest level of education you've attained?
I received my master's degree.
What degree did you receive in Hancock, Michigan?
That degree was a criminal justice.
Okay, so we're glitched.
After you completed your college, you returned to the Twin Cities area?
That is correct.
And is that when you first joined the Minneapolis Police Department?
Prior to that, I had worked as a community service officer at the Minneapolis St. Paul Airport Police Department.
What years did you do that?
I believe that was from 1987 to 1989.
And then in 1989, did you join the Minneapolis Police Department?
I did.
In what capacity?
I started my career as a Minneapolis police cadet, and then was hired as a Minneapolis police officer that year.
And Chief, why did you decide to become a police officer?
I've been very
Man, that's a whole 20 minutes.
come from a city of very
I gotta kill you, Arthur. I am so sorry.
proud people here in the city of Minneapolis, and my dear parents taught all of my siblings and me about the service of love, and so I've been very fortunate to then eventually join the Minneapolis Police Department and give back to the very community, the very city that embraced me and has been so good to me.
Are you familiar with the motto of the Minneapolis Police Department?
Yes, I am. And that is to protect with courage and to serve with compassion.
And what does that motto mean?
We are oftentimes the first face of government that our communities will see. And we will oftentimes meet them at their worst moments. And so the badge that I wear and that members of the Minneapolis Police Department wear means a lot because the first time that we interact with our community members may be the only time that they have an interaction, and so that has to count for something. And so so it's very important for us to make sure that we're meeting our community.
Poor Arthur.
Treating them with dignity, being their guardians, and representing and all of the men and women that came before us who served so proudly in this department.
Sometimes you have to protect with courage. You have to use force.
We need to round them up. I'll get
Sometimes, yes, as a police officer, you will have to use force.
Okay.
And sometimes serving with compassion means to understand what force is not. What does it mean to serve with compassion?
To serve with compassion, to me, means to understand and authentically accept that we see our neighbor as ourselves. We value one another. We see our community as necessary for our existence. And so that's what serving compassion means to me.
And you told us a little bit about your educational background. I'd like you to share with all of us a little bit more about your specific law enforcement training. You mentioned the academy. Is that where you received your law enforcement specific training?
Yes, it is.
Please describe how that training occurred.
I was a member of the first Minneapolis Police Cadet Program, and along with many other candidates, we received training, both academic training on the laws of the state of Minnesota. We received training as it relates to everything from driving and defensive tactics, community relations, and so we also, there was post requirements of Minnesota Post Officer Standards and Training to receive our license, which was a test that we had to take then. There was also scenario-based training as well, to grade and assess how we perform during that training in the academy. And so that was part of that important training that I received.
Well, Arthur needs to rest. I like you, son. And after the horses, we're gonna wait for the army to come. Wreak its revenge.
I hope not.
Of course we ain't. Now let's go check out that fort of theirs. This is a good idea. This is the only idea, and it is one that will serve for our purposes. The army ain't wild. Stop worrying. Oh, Shady told me about Cone. Meet us at Doyle's Tavern in Saint Denis when you can. Shall we go, son?
Certainly.
We'll start some light reconnaissance out at Fort Wallace, and when Cole's dealt with, you come meet us there. Don't touch. Yeah, well, I do. This is
Yellow.
the distraction that we need.
Your father said that fighting was an impossible gamble. There's no winning for you in this.
Father need not know anything. He'd rather live in ignorance.
Come along,
Your
gentlemen.
father would rather you did not do anything so foolish. I said I would stop this from happening. Would you talk to him?
Speak with Rangeful.
Yes. Would you?
Sure. I'll speak with him. You head on back to camp, check on the others, Dutch's behavior.
I understand. Thank you, Arthur.
Here. Yeah. Okay, girl. Son of a bitch! Yeah.
go. Let him go.
Now where'd be the fun in that?
Come on. Good. Ask for some, bitch. I can't defend myself.
What are you, sick in the head? Okay, my girl. Yep.
Mr. Morgan.
You still here, kid?
Yes. Mama can't leave. Won't leave. I don't know. I said I had the money. She said your money weren't moral. She said it'd be better to die than to take it.
Maybe she's right. I don't know. I don't know anything about morals.
She's still heading out. Working, you know?
I'm sorry, son. Sorry about all of this.
She ain't been back for a few hours. She left with some fella down the railway tracks. I did not like the look of him.
Which way, you say?
That way. Around the woods, towards, Willard's Rest.
I'll see what I can do.
jail.
That's enough now, partner. You're starting to scare me, let alone the poor woman. Clear off.
Who are you?
Someone who don't want to hear no more of your nasty mouth. Push me. I'll put a bullet in you.
I presume Archie sent you?
I said clear off before I deal with you.
See you again, dearie.
Listen to me. Excuse me.
You sound like my husband.
I know. Listen, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for what happened. I was, a fool. And I'm suffering from my foolishness. But don't go and get yourself killed because of your pride. You have a son, Mrs. Downs.
I'm just so ashamed.
Ashamed? Of what? You loved him? You did everything for him. Let's get you home.
All right. Let's go.
Yep. I'm sorry it had to come to this.
Why are we getting off?
So you was just talking about something?
Stop saying sorry. Sorry won't bring Thomas back.
I know.
So you're sick now too? And you think that affords you the opportunity for penance for cutting his time short?
No, I ain't looking for that.
Okay then. So just forget about me and the guilt you're carrying, because no good can come of that for either of us. And all you can do now is decide the man you want to be for the time you have left. Help someone who can still be helped. Or help yourself.
I suppose you're right.
Oh, hang yourself for all I care.
You're right to dislike me. I ain't looking for that to change. Archie should be waiting for us just up ahead.
Mama! Oh, you're so important. Archie, oh, we do.
Get out of here. Go. Live someplace else. Start over. Here. Take this. I don't need it no more.
I don't want your money.
Yeah, I know you don't want it.
I don't.
You sure as shit need it. Take it.
No.
I ain't looking for forgiveness. It ain't about that. But don't forgive me. Just take the money and get out of here. Please. I know I ruined your life. I suffer for it every day. But don't let yourself get killed for pride. I've seen it kill too many folks.
MPD is structured to deploy law enforcement services to
Don't thank me.
about
Just take the money,
420,000 people
pack your
over a
bags.
58 square
That's
mile
all I got.
area.
Thank you, Mr. Morgan.
I said don't
24
thank
hours a
me.
day, every
Get out of
day.
here.
Administratively, how is the department organized?
Way to go, Morgan, my nigga.
We are broken down into bureaus.
Do right, baby. Do right.
As I may have mentioned, you have the chief of police that really leads the organization and its mission and
Come on, Flash.
And then we have an assistant chief that oversees the daily operations. After that, there are 3 deputy chiefs. And, we have a deputy chief of patrol. Deputy chief of patrol is responsible for the 5 geographical precincts throughout the city of Minneapolis. We also have a deputy chief of professional standards. And that deputy chief oversees really 2 main functions, and that is our training for our entire department, as well as the internal affairs portion of our department. And then we have a deputy chief, the 3rd one, of investigations. So all of the employees who work, whether it's homicide unit, robbery, assault, that deputy chief oversees the investigations bureau. And we also have commanders who oversee these divisions. As I mentioned, they're above the civil service rank. They're appointed, and they serve in different divisions. And the precincts, as I mentioned, there's 5 geographical areas. We have 5 precinct inspectors, and they are like the chiefs of police for those precincts. Yes.
And so by my count, there were 3 bureaus. You have investigations, patrol, and professional standards. Is that right?
That is correct.
And the investigations bureau has a number of individual units within the bureau, correct?
That is correct.
For example, what type of units are there in investigations?
Yeah, investigations bureau has homicide, assault, robbery, crimes against children. There are several different investigative
That fun's gonna start!
That provides services such as 911 response and crime prevention, traffic control, emergency services, patrol bureau.
Yes.
Individuals. Within the patrol bureau.
Come on, bitch. I'm gonna be upset if I lose that horse.
Area of your jurisdiction.
Yes, it is.
And then can you just use 269 to describe the precincts and what they are and what purpose they serve?
I need to rewind you, buddy. 150.
We've always wanted to make this happen, so let's make it happen.
As another challenging school year is coming to an end, educators across the country, like Tulsa Public Schools Chief Learning Officer Ebony Johnson, are dreaming about the future.
We've been through so much as a country through the pandemic, and so to be able to get these dollars, it's exciting because we get to dream, so let's do.
Federal money is coming into districts within the next 60 days.
I'll go see Charlotte.
Says it will help get schools back to where they were pre-pandemic.
Micah, you
and
can
possibly
fucking wait, you
make them
bitch.
better than they were. You have more tools available to you now that you have had maybe in a long time. So what does that mean?
So for us, you know,
Don't get your ass kicked, black man.
We do not invest adequately in public education. So this investment will allow us to not only provide direct services to our children and families, but it's also going to help us to grow and expand.
The $1.9 trillion stimulus bill approved by Congress last month sets aside $129 billion for education. Those dollars flow from Washington across the country and end in states where they're dispersed to school districts like the one in Tulsa.
My boy.
District leaders divide it between
There you
all their
are.
schools. So some of it will land here at Monroe Demonstration Academy
You got
Middle
a
School.
stable.
Being able to now be back in
Nope.
person with the social distancing, with masks, with desk shields, has
Stable
been
your
amazing
butt.
to watch kids really just get back into the groove of things.
Tulsa leaders expect their school system to get around $128 million from the American Rescue Plan Act over the next 3 years.
So try taking this to the other side first.
That money is earmarked to not only get classrooms open, but for summer enrichment programs, after-school childcare, even a graduation boot camp, free to all students.
Graduation is priority, and you still need 1 or 2 credits left to graduate, and we will help you get there.
They should
Back
never
at Monroe,
put pink tips
interim
on you.
principal
What's wrong
Rob
with that,
Kaiser
bruh?
is excited about what this
Where the heck is she? Almost there.
Come on, girl.
Fair. Check on my homie. There's my girl.
Oh, hey there.
How you feeling, ma'am?
Much better than I felt in a long time. If we hadn't caught that rabbit, I don't think I'd have made it another day.
Well, you look better.
Better and determined, thanks to you. And if I'm gonna learn to hunt, I figured it was time I learned how to use Cal's gun properly.
How's that working out for you?
Well, let's just say my prey is looking decidedly unscathed. At the end of labor is to gain leisure. Is that not what Aristotle said?
Well, I don't know much about Aristotle, but well, I know a thing or two about shooting a gun. Look, you gotta hold steady and firm. You just focus, breathe slowly, and always pull the trigger on empty lungs. Here, I'll show you. Okay. Calm and steady. Don't snatch at the trigger.
You make it look so easy.
Yeah,
You try now. Remember to breathe.
Come on, Caroline. You got this, babe.
Breathe out. Need to breathe out.
Close. You closer than you've been.
Would you look at that? I haven't hit one that close all day.
Not bad. Focus on the inhale. Shoot on the exhale. My turn. I'll shoot a few more this time.
Looks like you need some practice yourself. Oh no, that wretched rat is back. Over there. It's been a thorn on my side ever since we moved here. Kill it, please. Alright, finally. Not that I could do any better. Come on.
You got this, Caroline. Yeah.
I hit it, didn't I?
Yeah, you hit it.
What can I say? Thank you.
Keep practicing, baby girl.
I still have some of the rabbit left that I salted up. Would you join me for a meal? It's the least I can do. Take a seat at the table. Food is just about done. Well, it's good and hot. I hope you enjoy it. You helped me to catch it after all. Bon appetit.
Huh?
Please enjoy. And thank you again for everything. I really am grateful.
It was nothing.
You're a good man.
You don't really know me.
I know enough. There's always more to find in ourselves. You helped me to see that. My husband, Cal, was such an optimist. I found that to be very contagious. But there's a fine line between optimism and naivete.
Mm-hmm.
We were both
naive.
With the silver spoon. Banquets, butlers, valets.
Sounds terrible.
There's just so many people, so many things. I was lost in it, crushed by it. My father was very overbearing. Then we came out here and I got crushed by this. You know, I pictured myself picking fresh vegetables, sipping homemade wine, writing a great novel. But I turned out to be a far more pathetic anti-heroine than any I could ever pen.
Oh, well. I reckon you're gonna be just fine.
Are you all right? Can I get you some water?
No, I'm fine. I just,
Pass out, Arthur.
Thank you for this. I think it's best if I make it.
Stay right there. It's gonna be okay.
Man, my lungs are kicking my butt.
My dear Arthur, I have gone out hunting. Not a phrase I thought any pen of mine would ever ink, but nonetheless one I am very proud to finally be able to write. I am so very grateful to you for all the help and encouragement you've given me. There is some money in a box on the nightstand. Please take it. I have far more than I need back in the city, and I'd like you to have it. Please take care, and remain true to the man I know you are.
No, Charlotte.
Let's go, girl. Yep.
Shut up. Whoa.
Story from Istanbul, Turkey, and
Aw, man.
Well, I mean, Jaman.
We continue to participate in the training that's been provided by MPD and is into two categories: pre-service training and post-service training. Is that right?
Yes.
And the pre-service training would include the academy that you just talked about. Is that right?
That is correct.
And then post-service training is the continuing education that you testified about previously. Is that right?
Yes.
So let's again focus on the academy training. How many cadets do you generally have at a given time per class?
Well, it's usually been a mixture of recruit classes and a cadet class. I would say that we average in terms of recruit class numbers around 30. Cadets might be 20 to 25.
So now I'm going to ask you to just define some terms a little and explain to the jury the difference between a recruit and a cadet.
Recruits are typically individuals who've already been laser focused on a career. Being a Minneapolis police officer is what I wanted to do. They typically have already at least their 2-year criminal justice or law enforcement degree. Most have completed their required skills training. Cadet was really created to capture diversity of candidates. And so the cadet might have individuals who may have had a psychology degree, but it's really streamlining them, and it's a little lengthier process,
beautiful when
but
you're
it's
not on top
really
of it.
getting them on board so that they meet the state requirements, the post requirements to get to be hired. And so the cadet program is a wonderful way for us to capture diversity within our police department. And so, but they both, once their programs are finished, they're both classes, whether you're recruit or cadet, you are ready to successfully become a Minneapolis police officer.
Do you also take lateral candidates?
Yes, lateral candidates, we certainly have had hirings of laterals in the years past, yes.
And do those individuals also go through a similar training as a recruit?
Yes, the laterals can. It's usually much smaller in length of time just because laterals are individuals who have already served as police officers, perhaps in another jurisdiction or another part of the state, or out of state, actually.
We'll get a more detailed description from another witness, but just at a very high level, can you describe what the trainees do at the academy during this pre-service training?
Trainees at the academy during pre-service, it's their first indoctrination into this world of being a police officer. So they're being taught about city and statutory laws. They're being trained on procedural justice and critical thinking, defensive tactics. They're having community members come in and speak to them about different aspects, whether it relates to things in our cultures within our city. Technology is a huge piece of that. Learning how to write reports on our computers. They're really getting that basic indoctrination into the Minneapolis Police Department.
As far as the methodology, is it typically classroom delivery? Do you also have practical application? How does that work?
Yeah, it's a layered approach. It's both the practical academic studying, examinations that occur, but it's also scenario based. And so there's scenarios that they will go through, and whether that's crisis intervention training or other aspects. So it's a layered approach to the training.
And in this pre-service training, then, once the officer or candidate has completed the pre-service training, What's the next phase before becoming a fully functioning police officer?
Once they complete that training, they're making sure, obviously, that they've met the requirement for the licensure for the Minnesota Post Board, and then ultimately they're going to get sworn in and hired on as Minneapolis police officers.
Are you familiar with a program called the Field Training Program, or FTO?
Yes, I am.
Is that part of the pre-service training?
That would be, yes.
Can you just give us a general description of what the FTO, or Field Training Program, is?
The Minneapolis Field Training.
They were gonna rape her anyway, bro.
Is really
fucking
once
raping ass.
the has gone through that series of pre-service training, it's now teaming them up with a mentor, basically. And they're being gauged and judged on certain performance measures. And it takes course over a period of several months, usually about 5 months. And they're given instruction. They're seeing how well they are able to handle certain types of situations, calls. And they're also having feedback, not only from the FTO, but they're also having conversations with the supervisors in the training bureau and seeing how they're doing. They're assessing their progression. In the event a candidate is not progressing, they're making sure that there's support mechanisms for that, where they need extra help. And yes, at times, we have candidates that don't successfully complete it. And so, but that's really getting them to the point where they can ultimately be really on their own and be able to function on their own as a sworn Minneapolis police officer.
And so once they've completed the field training program, and I think is, per your testimony thus far, the training doesn't stop there. You have post requirements that you have to fulfill every year in your post-service training. Is that right?
That's correct.
And is that delivered through a series of in-service trainings that occur at the same training facility you mentioned?
Yes.
Is that training optional? Can an officer go somewhere else to get their post credits and skip the in-service, or is that training required?
That training is required annually.
Do you have to take it?
Yes, I do.
What type of training is provided in the post-service training?
Some of the training that is provided in the annual training can be critical incident training, CIT training.
CIT is crisis intervention training?
Crisis intervention training, thank you. Yes, crisis intervention training, defensive tactics, basic CPR, first aid. Those are some of the types of training that is required annually.
Even though they've already ostensibly been trained on all of these things before, you're still doing the same training annually?
That is correct.
Why is that?
A lot of that is just to reemphasize the importance of the training itself, muscle memory, because all of our department members are being taught the same thing. We may have officers that are working in patrol capacity 1 year, and the next year they may be in investigations, but they may be called to assist upon. And so it's making sure that all of us have that basic, necessary, core fundamental training to better help serve our communities.
And so if you could give the jury kind of an idea of the amount of time that is spent training your officers.
It's a lot. We put a lot of time, energy, and resources into our training. I believe last year, the Minneapolis Police Department, in terms of our mandatory in-service training and leadership training, we probably spent about $8.5 million. And our pre-service and in-service training, that was probably about $4.5 million. So training is absolutely vitally essential to us as a department.
And officers are paid while they're being trained, is that correct?
Yes, they are.
And would it be fair to say that part of the objective of training is to impart Minneapolis Police Departmental policies onto the officers so that they know what those policies are and are able to apply them?
Yes, it's important through training that we're reemphasizing not only our policies but really our values as a police department.
and what our community expects of us. It's to help our officers, and it's also to help our communities at the same time.
As a former patrol officer who's used force, put handcuffs on people, I mean, you understand the reality of what policing is like when you're actually on duty. Is that right?
That is correct.
You also testified that you've participated and continue to participate in the training that's been provided by MPD and has continued to be provided. Is that
yes,
right?
That is correct.
Is this training practical and useful?
Yes, it is.
Why do you say that?
Our officers are being called, particularly patrol officers, are being called to, again, respond in a way to our community's needs. And it's hundreds of thousands of calls that they respond to. And, we are a very interesting profession in that to some professions, your body of work matters. And to an extent, within the Minneapolis Police Department, our body of work matters, but it's more internally. But to our communities, for the most part, your body of work doesn't hold as much value. We don't have the luxury of being able to go up to a community member for the first time and say, those 99 calls I was on before went really well. Trust me on this one. We don't have the luxury of doing that. Our communities are going, no, what have you done for me lately? This interaction, I'm going to grade you on how you treat me during this call, during this interaction. And so we have to make each engagement with our community count. And so the training is very important because for many in our communities, the first time that they encounter a Minneapolis police officer may be the only time in their life they do. And so that singular incident matters.
Aside from the usefulness of it to the community, what about the usefulness of it from a practical standpoint to the patrol officer out on the street? Is this training practical, or is it more aspirational?
No, it's very practical, and as I mentioned earlier, it's so important that we evolve as a police department and meet our communities where they are. And I'll give a couple examples if you don't mind. We've talked a lot about within the department that we know that our communities suffer at times and go through trauma. So it's very important for men and women to have training as it relates to how we respond in those moments, what resources can we provide for community. But one of the things that we have not talked about in this profession, sadly, is the impacts of trauma on our own officers. And so wellness, we do a great deal of training and work on officer wellness because we need to make sure that our officers are well when they're interacting with our communities in that regard. I will also tell you a few years ago, we were hearing from members of our transgender community and how they had felt police have played a role in their lives, and not always good, quite frankly. And so we were able to, through conversation, through discussion, through meetings, being very authentic, we were able to sit and craft a policy based upon members of our transgender, gender nonconforming community really guiding that. And we had the first policy ever in that. And so, again, it's so important that we as a police agency continue to evolve, continue to place value on all of our community members. And so that's very important.
Now, speaking of Minneapolis police policies, you're aware that the police department has a fairly extensive policy and procedure manual. It's pretty thick, correct?
Yes.
And is it important then for policies and procedures to be in a written form so that officers can understand what the expectations are?
Yes, it is.
And those are public documents so that the public, they're also able to see what the expectations of the police officers are, correct?
That is correct.
As the chief of police and being employed by MPD as long as you have, I take it you're familiar with the Minneapolis Police Department policy and procedure manuals and all the content contained inside?
Yes.
You in fact created some of these policies?
That is correct.
Are Minneapolis police officers required to be familiar with the various written policies?
Yes, we are.
And there's a policy requiring them to be familiar with the policies, correct?
Yes, that is correct.
Right. So if you would please publish Exhibit 207. If you would highlight Section 1-103. This is the policy about the policy, and it requires that the MPD employees shall be provided instructions on how to access the policy and procedure manual. Is that right?
That is correct.
And they're accountable for knowing how and where to access, and for knowing the contents of the manual. Is that right?
That is correct.
And they're also required to sign a receipt acknowledging their responsibility for knowing the contents of the manual, correct?
Yes.
Because the first policy manual that you would receive as a patrol officer might not be 30 years later what you're going to be looking at, correct?
Yes.
So the policies are changing, but they're published, they're public, and the officers are required to know what they are and to sign something saying that they will continue to review them. Is that right?
It's preliminary, overruled. Yes.
All right. Well, if you could take that one down, please. At this time, asked to just display to the witness Exhibit 274 for identification. Sir, do you recognize this is a general form here of being an electronic version of the MPD policy and procedure manual acknowledgement?
Yes, I do.
This is an example of an acknowledgement form that a Minneapolis Police Department employee, patrol officer would sign upon being hired. Is that right?
Yes.
Just indicating that they're aware that there are written policies and committing to reviewing them and accessing them. Is that right?
Yes.
At this time, I'm going to offer Exhibit 274.
And you are watching testimony from Minneapolis Police Chief Madaria Arredondo right now. He is testifying, of course, the latest witness in the trial of Derek Chauvin, who is charged with the murder in the death of George Floyd. Some exhibits being shown now. We've been hearing a lot from the chief, not only about his own experience, but sort of the nuts and bolts of the training, the post-service requirements, the regular trainings that are required of officers, talking about how they're still, what they need to know every day when they go on the job. I want to bring in now Laura Coates, CNN senior legal analyst, former federal prosecutor. So this is obviously all building up to something, right, Laura? Especially as we think about the testimony we heard even on Friday, when Lieutenant Zimmerman said it was totally unnecessary in terms of the use of force that he saw now former Officer Chauvin use. What is the prosecution building at this point by laying out the nuts and bolts of the training?
I mean, try telling the person who wrote the policy, who's had an experience in every different, essentially, aspect of being a Metropolitan Police officer in Minneapolis. Imagine trying to tell him that he doesn't know what the training is. Remember the tactic that was used by the defense with Lieutenant Zimmerman. You're a veteran officer. You've been on the force so long, sir. Perhaps you're out of touch with what use of force should be used and what it looks like to be a patrolling officer. A little bit of a condescension that was baked into that particular strategy.
Laura,
Try telling the chief of police what he doesn't know.
I think we've just gone back to some of the questioning, but we'll pick that back up. Let's listen in.
Department has a code of ethics, is that right?
Yes.
And the code of ethics is contained within the policy manual. Forgive me, we're going to be talking a lot about the policy manual and kind of march through some of these, but the code of ethics, if you could please display Exhibit 215.
Fucking white man.
And if you could highlight 5-10201.
Oh, yes, they will. Oh, no, they can't. Poor babies.
And as the Code of Ethics provides in the policy manual, law enforcement officers' fundamental duty to serve mankind and safeguard lives and property, and to protect the innocent against deception, the weak against oppression and intimidation. Is that right?
That is correct.
And if you could take that down, Minneapolis Police Department also has a professional policing policy, is that right?
Yes.
At a high level, can you describe what professional policing means in this context?
Yes, our Minneapolis Police Department professional policing, it's really about treating people with dignity and respect, above all else, at the highest level. It's that we see each other as necessary,
the way Negro squirrel,
we value one another, and it's really treating people with the dignity and respect they deserve.
If we could display then Exhibit 215, and drawing your attention to page 4, section 5-104.01. Sir, is this the professional policing policy?
Yes, it is.
And could you read the first bullet, please?
The first bullet reads, "Be courteous, respectful, polite, and professional."
And if you would then also read the third bullet.
Ensure that the length of any detention is no longer than necessary to take appropriate action for the known or suspected offense.
And you can take that down, please. Sir, fair to say that law enforcement generally has changed a lot since you started back in 1989, is that right?
That is correct.
In 1989, you didn't have body-worn cameras, correct?
That is correct.
And nor did you have sort of the ability for civilians, bystanders, to video or record conduct of police officers, right?
We did not.
Because we didn't have smartphones.
That's true.
And now we do.
Yes.
And as you indicated, the policies and culture of the police department has to change with the times, is that right?
Yes.
And so in terms of understanding that sometimes bystanders do use their smartphones to take video images of police officers, has the Minneapolis Police Department imparted any training or constructed any policies to prepare officers for people recording?
Yes, we have. We've imparted policy that really is informing officers that individuals under their First Amendment rights, they have the absolute First Amendment right to record through cell phone video or other types of video officers interacting or engaging with a community member, with the exception that they cannot obstruct the activity of the officers, but they absolutely have the right, barring that, to record us performing our duties.
And what does obstruct mean in this context?
Obstruct would mean interfering, doing something where you are physically placing yourself in a position where you're prohibiting the officers from carrying out their lawful duties. But barring that, individuals have the right to record our engagement with our community.
Well, Chief, you'd have to acknowledge that a patrol officer may find it irritating to have a civilian recording their activities. True?
Very true.
Is that obstruction?
It is not.
At this time, I'd like to display to the witness only Exhibit 273. And if I may step away for a moment. And at this time, I will offer Exhibit 273.
Any objection? No objection. 273 is received.
If you would publish 273, and I'd like to draw your attention to Section 9-202. And again, this is the public recording of police activities, providing employees guidance with dealing with members of the public, recording them. Is that right?
Yes, it is.
And generally, this informs officers that unless you're being obstructed, people get to record you.
Yes.
Even if you don't like it.
That is correct.
And how long has this been policy of MPD?
Since May of 2016.
Thank you. You can take that down. Sir, are you familiar with the concept of de-escalation?
Yes.
What is de-escalation?
De-escalation is providing a knowledge base or skills, in this case for officers, to really focus on time, options, and resources. It's really primarily trying to provide an opportunity to stabilize a situation, to de-escalate it, and what the goal is having a safe and peaceful outcome. And so there's tools associated with that, but that's really the goal of de-escalation: time, options, and resources, so that we can stabilize the situation peacefully and safely.
When you think of de-escalation, are you thinking of it as the sort of the opposite of using force, or is it a part of using force?
We teach it as both.
And when you started with the department back in 1989, was there an emphasis on de-escalation?
It was not mentioned. It's not really back then.
Okay. When did de-escalation start becoming more of a topic of conversation in law enforcement communities?
I think that right around late 90s, 2000, I think that when we were, when there was attention, not only in Minneapolis, but in departments across the country, and incidents particularly involving police encounters with those who were suffering from mental illness, we really started to see a lot of work on that. Here locally, the Barbara Schneider Foundation, there was a very tragic incident in Minneapolis many years ago that involved the death of a community member. But when we started, that was really what kind of culminated for our department, de-escalation. And even when you heard departments starting to talk about other tools like tasers, all of these types of things, it was around that time frame that I think our department really started getting a lot more education awareness and training as it relates to de-escalation.
What about just, even if you weren't taught de-escalation formally when you started back in 1989, as a practical matter in practice, is that something that's been employed by experienced police officers for a long time now?
Yes, it has.
Well, what about in your own experience when you were on patrol? Did you use de-escalation techniques?
Yes, quite a bit. Yes.
Did you find them to be effective, a way to maybe talk somebody down from a situation rather than needing to use force?
Yes, and what the primary goal is that you want to keep yourself safe as an officer, and you also want to keep the community safe. And so a lot of it hinged on communication and listening and verbal skills. And so if you could talk your way out of a situation to de-escalate where it didn't have to result in physical force, those are things you certainly utilized, and you're always in a better position to look upon someone that you worked with who had that skill set to do that.
But if you can't talk somebody out of the situation, if you can't de-escalate, you can't, right? And you have to then use a different method.
That is true.
And so it really comes to what's reasonable at the time. Is that right?
Yes.
Does Minneapolis Police Department currently have a de-escalation policy?
We do.
And at this time, if I can display Exhibit 219. You have this one, okay. I think it is admitted, I just want to make sure you have it. Okay. Yes, if we could publish Exhibit 219. And then Minneapolis Police Department policy 5-304, threatening the use of force and de-escalation. This is the policy, and it's a policy as it existed on May 25, 2020. Is that right?
That is correct.
If we could highlight the first paragraph A, threatening the use of force.
That's simple.
And I'd like you, sir, to please just read into the record the paragraph that you see here. All the way up until, I guess, the first sentence. We'll make you read the whole thing.
As an alternative and/or the precursor to the actual use of force, MPD officers shall consider verbally announcing their intent to use force, including displaying an authorized weapon as a threat of force, when reasonable under the circumstances.
And I guess, is it an either-or alternative? Is it like you either de-escalate or use force, and once you start using force, you just give up on de-escalation?
The goal is to resolve the situation as safely as possible. So you want to always have de-escalation layered into those actions of using force.
And if you could take that down and highlight paragraph B, de-escalation. In accordance with the policy, officers, the language here is mandatory when reasonable, whenever reasonable, shall use de-escalation tactics to gain voluntary compliance. Is that right?
Yes.
And to seek to avoid or to minimize the use of physical force, correct?
Yes.
And seeking to minimize physical force, that can be happening while physical force is being employed, can't it?
Yes.
An officer can be using physical force, and during the course of that, still maintain attempts to de-escalate and defuse the situation.
Yes.
Okay. And if you could clear that, please. And as part of a de-escalation, the policy indicates the officers are supposed to do what?
Attempt to slow down or stabilize the situation so that more time, options, and resources are available.
When you talk about more time, options, and resources, could options and resources include, for example, using other officers who may be at the scene?
Yes.
Or calling for backup?
Yes. Actually, it can also include seeking community's help in a situation as well.
And in employing de-escalation techniques, in accordance with the policy, the officer is required to consider a number of factors regarding the subject. Is that right?
Yes.
And we're assuming here that the subject is non-compliant. You run into people who, maybe don't want to comply with police officers, but you can also run into people who just, for some reason, are unable to do so at that moment. Is that right?
Yes.
And officers are required to consider, if you could highlight B and the bullets that come underneath. Officers under the Minneapolis de-escalation policy are required to consider whether the subject's lack of compliance is a deliberate attempt to resist or an inability. Is that right?
Yes.
And if you could read, first, the first bullet is medical conditions, correct?
Yes.
We have mental impairment, developmental disability, physical limitation. Some of you may just be physically unable to comply, correct?
Yes.
Language barrier. The city of Minneapolis has a variety of people who speak a variety of different languages. Someone just may not understand you. Right?
That is correct.
And if you're not considering that, perhaps the situation could escalate into something greater than it would need to be.
Yes.
The last two bullets, first, could you read the second to the last bullet?
Yes. One of the other considerations officers should take into account is the influence of drug or alcohol use.
How so?
We know the research says that people can react differently when they're under the use of alcohol or drugs, and so you trying to give verbal commands, if someone's under the use of alcohol or drugs, or you're doing force, it may have a different reaction to them, so that should be something that you should be considering.
And 12:30. Sir, drug or alcohol use, I mean, in this context is being required that the officer consider to determine if de-escalation is appropriate. It can be true that some people who are under the influence of drugs or alcohol can become dangerous, correct?
That is correct.
But isn't it also true that some people react completely different and they are not necessarily dangerous if they're under the influence of alcohol or drugs?
That is correct.
In fact, they may not be more dangerous, they may actually be more vulnerable.
True.
And it's important that the officer considers that when determining whether to go the route of force or continued force or de-escalation. Fair?
Yes.
Behavioral crisis is the last bullet I'd like you to discuss. What do you mean by behavioral crisis?
Behavioral crisis, of all the bullets, sometimes that is probably the one that our men and women experience in our communities most. If someone loses a job, that can trigger a behavioral crisis. If someone loses a loved one, that can trigger a behavioral crisis. If someone has themselves got the worst diagnosis from their doctor that day, that can trigger a behavioral crisis. And so we want our folks to take all of those things into consideration. When I talk about meeting our community where they are, that's probably the one that we need to really focus on. Yeah.
And as you testified earlier, the police just don't get to meet people on their very best day, do they?
No, they don't.
And the behavioral crisis, as the kind you've described here, can in fact be a barrier to compliance. It would cause an inability to comply, even if not, an intentional inability to comply. That's fair.
Let's go to the list, please.
Yeah. And so the purpose of the, listing the behavioral crisis as a point of consideration for a law enforcement officer is what?
Again, it's recognizing that when we get the call from our communities, it may not often be their best day, and they may be experiencing something that is very traumatic. But we're going to respond. But we have to take that into consideration because, as I mentioned again, we may be the first and last time they have an interaction with a Minneapolis police officer, and so we have to make it count. It matters.
Would this be a good time to stop before I go to the next line? I'm sorry, I was trying to push it to the time limit. So.
All right, members of the jury, we'll take our lunch break. Come back at 1:30. Chief, you may step out.
So you've just been watching some of the testimony from Minneapolis Police Chief Daria Arredondo. They are taking a short lunch break, an hour lunch break, I should say, not short right now. So I just want to take a closer look at what we've heard this morning. Joining me now, Laura Coates, CNN senior legal analyst and a former federal prosecutor, and Cedric Alexander, the former president of the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives. For folks who are just joining us this morning, we heard a little bit earlier from the ER doctor who actually pronounced George Floyd dead. And right now, as I mentioned, we're currently listening to testimony, questioning from the prosecution for Minneapolis Police Chief Arredondo. And what's really stood out to me, Laura, you and I had started to talk about this, is this is clearly, there is a reason, as we know, behind all of these questions. But you see the prosecution laying out, this is the code of conduct. This is the training that all police officers must go through. And the fact that right there at the end, what we've been hearing about for the last several minutes, is about de-escalation, Laura, and whether that can include use of force or not. That's a really interesting point.
It is, Erica, for a variety of reasons. One, we're talking about the use of force as a continuum, constantly having to reassess the level of force that you need to use in order to restrain or subdue a resisting, non-compliant suspect. But on that continuum, of course, are going to be a variety of tactics: verbal threat of use of force, the brandishing of a weapon, the idea of handcuffing, the idea of recognizing that perhaps crisis intervention needs to come into play here, and using non-physical force to subdue. And you still have that line in the sand eventually, Erica, about going from the reasonable use of force on that continuum and the conversion of it to criminal assault. And you have here a witness who you're not going to be able to try to undermine in the way they tried to last week, Lieutenant Zimmerman, talking about the tenure of this officer in a bit of a condescending, patronizing way. This is a chief of police for a reason. He has extraordinary experience across all of the different spectrums of the force, and he is able to say and reject any thought that suddenly, somehow, there was no training in this issue, or even worse, that they were trained to kill in this manner.
In the immediate aftermath of George Floyd's death, the chief fired Chauvin and released a rather damning statement, and I want to read part of that for you both right now. He said the death, quote, was not due to a lack of training. The training was there. Chauvin knew what he was doing. The officers knew what was happening. One intentionally caused it, and the others failed to prevent it. This was murder. It wasn't a lack of training. Cedric, at the time, I think everybody sort of took a pause when they saw that statement. Hearing from the chief this morning and looking back on those words, what are you taking away from what we've heard so far this morning?
Well, that was a very strong statement then, and I still believe that the chief stands at it's a still very strong statement now. If you look at the testimony over the last hour with Chief Arredondo, what you will notice, all of us notice and have heard, someone who has a 30-plus year career. He came up from the bottom of that organization as a cadet right up to chief of police. He is smart. He is very articulate with his thoughts and his thinking process. He is one that presents himself as being very confident. And in addition to that, he's very well respected across this country as a chief of police. I think the testimony that you heard and what he's standing on and the policies that he helped adopt and write over the last number of years really speaks to his credibility. And as you just heard Laura say, it's going to be very, very difficult to undermine a person of his stature and his credibility and his authenticity in his testimony this morning, which is huge.
There is so much of what we have heard from him was about the interaction with the community, and in fact, he sort of ended on that note in his last answer there, that this may be the first and only opportunity that any officer has to interact with whoever the member of the community is that they are meeting in that moment. Recognizing he was talking about that they may not be having their best day. Laura, setting that out there, talking about the way each officer should approach each interaction with not only the people who may have called or the person who may have called, but those around them in the moment. That stood out to me as well.
It does, Erica, and I go back to the comments of that mixed martial artist fighter who talked about, I called the police on the police. I didn't see a human connection between the people on the scene. I needed help some other way. There was a clear indication here throughout the testimony that they believe that these officers somehow were acting in a rogue manner, that they were not upholding what people believe to be what should happen in these interactions. And so there was some divide even then. There was a realization even then of the constant imploring to please do something that is coming back right now. But you know what's interesting here, Erica? This might be the first day in this trial that we have not heard from the star witness in this Derek Chauvin trial. The star witness is the video. The star witness is a photograph of Floyd. The star witness is the realization and the continual reminder after 2 days off for this jury, only a half day on Friday, of what's happening here. I suspect they're going to have this chief of police revisit that, revisit why he made the statement he did, why there was the swift firing, why this was in his mind murder. And one final point here. One of the statements he made, what you read, was it was intentional. Remember, Derek Chauvin is being charged with unintentional murder. It does not mean that he did not intend to act. Unintentional murder means you did not intend to kill, but you intended to perform the action and behavior that caused the death. It's a legal nuance that the jury will have to be made aware of in jury instructions.
You know, as we look at this training, just a quick question on the training itself, because I've been learning so much this morning about what that required training is and the ongoing training that officers will go through as it's updated. The chief said they spend something like $4 million a year on training. Senator, put that in perspective for us. How does that compare with other departments around the country? Is that on par?
Yeah, pretty much. And if you look at the size of that city, over 400,000, you have 700 plus police officers he's reporting he has to date. And so when you think about training, and it's a variety of different training that they go through every year, and they have to meet that post-qualification, that peace officer and standards qualification training for 700 and some officers, and that's firearms training, that's de-escalation training, that's bias training, that is a lot of different training. Those that work in traffic, those that work in special victims or homicide investigators who get certain specialized training. So when you put it in that context, it does involve a great deal of training in order for that police department to maintain its certification and for its members to maintain their certification as well.
As I mentioned prior to hearing from Chief Arredondo this morning, we heard from the ER doctor who tried to revive George Floyd, to save him when he arrived at the hospital. He was asked very specifically about what information he did not have. Take a listen.
There was no obvious significant external trauma that would have suggested that he suffered anything that could produce bleeding.